26, and we're going to have a presentation from the Climate Action Plan and from some committee members that took part in all that. And of course, we're kind of interested, our committee and the agricultural portion, the subcommittee of that. And I think quickly before we get started, we'll introduce ourselves as committee members because we're new to most of you, or quite a few of you. So, Chris.
Good morning, everybody. Senator Chris Pearson from Chittenden.
Hi, all. I'm Anthony Polina, Washington County.
Brian Collmore, representing the Rutland County District.
Corey Parent, I represent Franklin County and Alberg.
And I'm Bobby Starr from Orleans, Essex County, and chair the committee. So we may as well, I don't know how your screen's set up, but Abby's up next to me. Why don't we run around our guests and they can each introduce themselves before we get started. Abby?
Okay, good morning, everybody. Good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for having us in here, Senator Starr. We're excited to try to frame out some of our work from, this summer and beyond about how agriculture can be a part of the solution moving forward to a climate resilient future. I farm down in Whitingham, Vermont in Windham County with my folks. We're organic dairy producers at the Course Farm Dairy. I served as the Farm and Forest Sector representative to the Climate Council and the co-chair of the Agriculture and Ecosystems Subcommittee. And excited to be with all of you today, and I'll hand it over to Jane.
Thank you, Abby. Morning, everyone. Jane Lazorchuk. I work at the Agency of Natural Resources as the director of the Global Warming Solutions Act and had the benefit of serving the Vermont Climate Council over the last year to help stand up the state's first climate action plan. And looking forward to letting all the wonderful counselors gathered here today to dive through some of the details of the work of the Agricultural and Ecosystem Subcommittee, but happy once everybody introduces themselves to provide a broad overview of what's in the Climate Action Plan first. So I'll kick it over to Lauren.
Thank you, Jane. Good morning, everyone. My name is Lauren Oates. In my day job, I am the Interim Director of Government Relations and Policy at the Nature Conservancy. I was appointed by this body to represent expertise to natural hazards and resilience to them. I sat on the steering committee, which is primarily why I'm here today with you all, but I was also on the Agriculture and Ecosystem Subcommittee with Abby and Brian when he joins, and I'm excited to talk with you all and them about the role that our natural and working lands play in adapting to our changing climate. Jared.
Good morning. Good morning, Chairman Starr, senators of the committee. My name is Jared Duvall. It's been a while since I was last with the Senate Agriculture Committee, I think 7 or 8 years. I previously served as Economic Development Director at the Agency of Commerce and Community Development, where I was the designee to the Working Lands Enterprise Board. So I was very glad to work with you all then, and thank you for your support of that program. I am testifying today as a member of the Vermont Climate Council, where I co-chair the Science and Data Subcommittee and also serve on the cross-sector mitigation subcommittee. My day job is as executive director of the Energy Action Network, but my testimony today is not on behalf of or representing EA and the organization or our network. It is just in my capacity as a climate counselor. So, but thank you.
Yeah, well, thank you, Jared, and thanks all of you. We'll begin our meeting hearing from the co-chair of the Ag Committee, Abby Course, and vice or co-chair of that committee. And so we'll let you lead off, Abby, if you will, please. Senator Pearson.
Mr. Chair, I just want to jump in because Abby didn't include this, but the way the Climate Council was set up was that the administration, the House, and the Senate each had appointees, and
And
I'm very proud to say that Abby was one of the Senate appointees, and I'm confident she worked for the whole state, but in this case, she's sort of here with the home team, and I just wanted to point that out. So, thank you, Abby. I look forward to your thinking.
Yep. Thank you, Chris.
Thanks, everybody. I guess I'm trying to think of the way that this makes the most sense. I know that Jane has kind of a broad overview of the CAP as well, but I'll just frame out sort of the work that happened on the subcommittee first, just as kind of a broad overview as to how we approached it. I think, as I testified last week in House Agriculture, I think it's interesting, I'm not certain that everyone involved always thinks, like, the first word that comes to mind when they think about climate change and agriculture is opportunity, but it is the first word that comes to my mind when I think about agriculture and climate change. Certainly, agriculture is a large contributor to the issues at hand regarding emissions, but it also, and particularly in Vermont, where so much of our land base is in these natural systems, and we have really, I think, a great start to so many programs as to how to continue implementing this work, that we really do have, I think, an opportunity here. But there are some as is the case with everything, systemic issues that stand in our way of really fully realizing the opportunity that could be there. Essentially, the way that we tried to frame the recommendations for our committee, and I'll preface this by saying that as far as I understand, and it says my internet connection is unstable, so I'll turn my video off. As far as I understand it, this was the first time that folks from the, ecosystem realm and folks from the agricultural realm were put in one space together and told to play nicely in the sandbox. I think that this was really necessary and a really good start to thinking about this work ahead as an opportunity. But I think that what needs to be understood in terms of the recommendations we came up with is, on one hand, there's a boon to them in that they were achieved by a broad consensus of a diverse group of stakeholders. The downside is that the level of granularity I have heard expressed is not quite to the level that, folks in each of those camps were really looking for it to be. So certainly there is more work ahead in terms of thinking of the specifics and the little details of how we're going to get there. But what I want to kind of explain to you about the way that we approach the recommendations was, as much as possible, I do think there's a lot of really good work and really good programs in place. And so we tried to tie into those whenever possible. In other words, or to suggest, fully funding VHCB and the Farm and Forest Viability Program, because we know what immense importance that work has, particularly to our new and beginning farmers who, don't have, maybe didn't go to school for farming and don't know how to get those businesses off the ground. Additionally, fully funding WeLab, the Working Lands Enterprise Board, the conservation districts, things like that, the people that have a program in place but really need the funding to get the boots on the ground to get to the people who are trying to implement the policy on a daily basis. And so that's kind of a broad overview. We also were thinking a lot about, farmland conservation and enhanced agronomic practices. You'll see, I'm sure you're all aware that, the governor called that out in his budget. We certainly are really supportive of as much money as possible going towards increased agronomic practices, as Vermont is, and Vermont's farmers are light years ahead in this regard, but, why stop now? And let's keep going. And these are really important for the myriad of co-benefits that they add, both from an emissions reduction standpoint and additionally from the capability for resilience and adaptation in the land base. Another thing that we talked about a lot, and I think is something that for this committee, I would encourage you to be thinking about strategically is, as I indicated earlier, a lot of the funding structures we have in place and a lot of the ways that we get money and resources to the farmers are through farm programs and investments in farms. And I think what we need to start understanding is that farms don't function without people. And at a certain point, we have to begin to invest in the people who are doing this work, because we stand in this moment with the development pressures we face with climate migration continuing. We're at a nexus right now. And what we do desperately need, and I just know this from my own truth of the work that I do every day, is we desperately need people who can, and I said this in House Ag, go out every day, look at the weather, look at the conditions on the ground, and figure out some way within the ever increasing tiny margins that farmers exist in to continue to produce food for us. Because food security is one of the first things that goes with the realities of climate change coming. We're already seeing this as farmers. Every year, the conditions become worse and worse. And as we saw in COVID, the tenuous nature of our food systems and our supply chains was very apparent then and will only continue as we move forward. And so whatever we can do to ensure that our systems of farming are set up to feed our people is going to be really important. And so we've also included a lot of recommendations about local food access funding, Vermont Farm to School Network. I'll put the plug in always for UVM Extension. I know you heard from John Roberts and Brian Kemp the other day, and they hammered that point home well enough, so I don't need to do it too. But I would add that, for example, you heard them say that they're losing two really critical resources in Kirsten Workman and Jeff Carter. And I will just say that down here in the very south of the state, we don't have UVM Extension except for Vern Grubinger, who's amazing, but is fruit and berry and vegetable. So, we're already in a position where, depending on where you are as a state, the resources to you as you're trying to produce food are very unevenly distributed because of the fact that these systems have been, strategically from up above kind of reduced in the ways that they're able to meet the farmers on the ground. I'll leave it there for now. I want to leave time for questions, et cetera. And I want to turn it over to Jane to sort of understand how we are going to place this work in the context of the broader climate action plan, unless there are any questions specifically from anything I just shared. I know I did that fast.
Any questions from committee members right now, specifically for Abby? If not, we'll move on to Jane and hear from her. Welcome, Jane.
Thank you, Chair Starr. Morning, everyone. Thank you, Abby, for kicking us off with that. I believe that Linda has made available to you all a draft, not a draft, the initial climate action plan, but a full copy. So hopefully you have that for reference after today's conversation. And I also shared with Linda the presentation I'm about to give, and understanding that there's a lot of expertise sitting here today to testify, I'll try to move quickly through the presentation so we can dive back in to the specifics of the agricultural recommendations and the expertise sitting around the table. But please don't hesitate to raise your hand. I'll try to monitor it as I'm going, so that if you have any questions along the way, I'm happy to pause and try to answer. But this is and I also appreciate Jared, Lauren, Abby, Ryan, others who have seen me give this presentation now numerous times, sitting through it again. So thank you, everybody, for being here and for all the work that's gone into this. Again, for the record, Jane Lazorchek, I'm the director of the Global Warming Solutions Act, and I sit within the Agency of Natural Resources and then have the benefit of helping serve and stand up the good work of all the council members and subcommittee members as well. I don't think I need to tell folks who work and experience work on the land with agriculture that the climate is changing. But these statistics are from the newly published Vermont Climate Assessment. And we also have the benefit of the National Climate Assessment, which was just published with a summary for Vermont. Now that we're trying to make a clear direction and connection to between the Climate Action Plan and the evidence that we're now seeing on the ground and experiencing with our winters warming faster than our summers with an average of 4 degrees over the last numerous decades, as well as spring arriving 2 weeks earlier, winter starting 1 week later, and annual precipitation increasing by 7 inches, with many of those rain events falling with greater intensity with storms of greater than an inch. And this is not to say that that doesn't also mean drought and other extreme conditions. So the weather and the variability for people who work the land is getting increasingly challenging to navigate. The Global Warming Solutions Act was passed more than a year ago. It was enacted in the fall of 2020, with the first Climate Council meeting stood up just shortly after that in November. The Climate Council, as others, and as Senator Pearson alluded to with Abby's great representation from the Senate, is comprised of 8 appointments from the, 15 appointments in total from the Senate and House, and 8 appointments that are filled by administration officials. Those 15 appointments coming from the Senate and House represent varying interests that have a stake in climate change opportunities and solutions, and brought wonderful expertise as well as connections to their communities and networks. The subcommittees, which are really where the heart of the work took place, the technical expertise, the diversity that was brought in, began to meet in February of last year. 4 of those subcommittees, cross-sector mitigation, rural resilience and adaptation, ag and ecosystems, and the Just Transition Subcommittee, were stood up and recognized in the statute, and the council had the ability to stand up any other subcommittees necessary to do the work. And that brought science and data online to really create the underpinning of the science and data needs to stand up such a robust climate action plan for the state. The cross-sector mitigation really tackled the emissions reductions component of the law. Rural resilience and adaptation thought about the needs of rural communities and resilience and adaptation being built into our communities and built environment infrastructure. Ag and ecosystems was thinking a lot about natural solutions for climate change, as well as the impacts and opportunities on our natural and working lands, such as carbon sequestration and storage. And Just Transitions finally was really thinking about the impacts and opportunities with the transition from decarbonizing our communities and the really huge amount of transition and change that we need to meet the emissions reductions as well as build resilience and adaptation in our state going forward. This is all to say that the council met ambitiously as well as the subcommittees to stand up the first climate action plan as required by statute on December 1st. We do call it the initial plan, largely recognizing the lack of specificity that Abby referred to in some of these areas, and just the continual and iterative nature of this work to engage with Vermonters and really think about the opportunities and solutions going forward. What is in the plan? Well, I think most of you are aware that there were really ambitious emissions reductions requirements put forward with the Global Warming Solutions Act. These had been on the books as goals, but we weren't as a state moving as aggressively as some would like to see to get us there. So these are now statutory requirements, with the first coming in 2025 of more than 25% below our 2005 levels, and then 40% below our 1990 levels by 2030, which is a pretty close to being approximately half of our emissions from where we sit today. So this is a really steep and ambitious requirement. The plan tries to prioritize those who are most effective. You'll see some of the work of Just Transitions and the work that we continually need to do better in this area. As I said, it was shaped by the 5 subcommittees, with the work lifting up and being ultimately approved by the council itself. It was coordinated with our comprehensive energy plan, which was also adopted this month, January, and we worked really closely to ensure that those 2 plans speak to each other where there's a direct overlap and coordination needed, especially with our energy sector. The plan must be updated at least every 4 years by statute, but likely will be updated a bit more frequently, especially right out of the gate, knowing the further work we have to do, especially in the resilience and adaptation space. There's an implementation section, which is really a handoff back to the legislature and other decision makers to move forward with passing the necessary legislation that we'll need to meet these ambitious requirements. And then we put forward a framework for how we'll measure progress. And that's an area of work that you'll hear me speak about a little bit more later, understanding that the Agency of Natural Resources is obligated for standing up a measuring and progress tool, and we're working really closely with the council to coordinate moving that forward now. So there were 7 objectives charged to the Climate Council to stand up within this plan. I have highlighted in green what really feels like the central components of the Climate Action Plan: reducing greenhouse gas emissions across all sectors, achieving long-term sequestration and storage of carbon through best management practices and protection of our natural and working lands. There's a requirement to be net zero across all sectors by 2050. And then we're also working to build and encourage climate adaptation and resilience in Vermont's communities and natural systems. This has sort of become the mind map for many of us around the differing requirements within the GWSA around GHG mitigation and adaptation, resilience, and sequestration. While there are objectives for both of these, and we all believe they are equally important with respect to meeting our climate solutions for the state. For example, we can cut all of our emissions, but the climate is clearly changing, and we need to think about how we adapt and build resilience. There is a varying level of requirements within the GWSA. There are these statutory requirements around mitigation that kind of holds a hook and leaves the door open for the Agency of Natural Resources to have litigation against it in the emissions reduction space, whereas adaptation, resilience, and sequestration are largely left, not consistent with the same level of requirements within the law. And this is something we'll be looking at and working with the council on going forward about what the necessary objectives are and attributes to measure so that we can hold ourselves accountable for building adaptation resilience in our communities equally to cutting our emissions. The guiding principles for just transitions were some of the first work that was stood up by the council. This framework for the council and the subcommittees to evaluate and adjust and prioritize recommendations came out of the Just Transitions Committee and was adopted by the council over the summer. There are 6 principles that were put forward and were challenged to meet, recognizing the unbelievable timeline that we are on to stand up this first plan. But it is something that's been really a first-time approach to a state government planning process, and something that, while we know we could work harder on implementing, something that I think the council should be rightfully very proud of standing up, and something that we'd like to see replicated for other state planning processes. There are 6 principles, as I said. They're articulated across the bottom. Moving at the speed of trust is clearly one that was the hardest, appreciating that there was also balance with the need to act on a speedy timeline, appreciating the standing up of the plan, as well as the urgency of climate change. But in order to operationalize these 6 principles, the Just Transitions Committee went further and developed a scoring rubric for us to be thinking about as we design and implement these policies that we need to put in place to realize the recommendations in the Climate Action Plan. So this is something that we'll be working closely with policymakers, state agencies, decision makers to ensure that we are putting equity front and center as we move forward and implement the plan. The plan is designed around 5 impact areas designed to meet those objectives that I highlighted at the beginning. There's cutting climate pollution, capturing carbon, resilient working in natural lands, cross-cutting solutions, and vital communities. I'll walk through some of the high-level recommendations from each of these buckets, and then turn back to what the next steps are for the council before turning it open for questions and conversations. So cutting climate pollution. This is really the large bucket of work around reducing emissions from transportation, buildings, energy, and products. This graph, which if you haven't seen, I feel like I see it on a daily basis, was produced actually by the organization that Jared Duvall, who's with us today, represents, EAN, using the data that comes from our greenhouse gas inventory that is produced by the Department of Environmental Conservation within ANR. It is illustrative of the sector's contributions for emissions and illustrates where we need to go with the reductions in order to meet our GWSA requirements. So as I alluded, there is the first reduction requirement comes in 2025, so just 3 short years away. And that is 26% below our 2005 levels. So that baseline year that is illustrated here is really driving how far those emissions need to get. And you'll see that the baseline year based on how it was written within the GWSA changes from 2025 to the 2030 requirement, driving that really steep reduction between 2025 and 2030. So we're trying to get 40% below 1990 levels. And that really is going to be a challenge and really a collaborative effort between the agency moving forward with rulemaking, the legislature needing to act, and others taking it upon themselves to be really thinking about what are the creative solutions, incentives, programs, and policies needed for us to get there. And transportation and buildings and thermal are the 2 largest emission sectors that really we've made very little progress in over the last number of decades that need to be the focus now on how to meet those solutions.
Jane, could I ask?
Yeah, go ahead.
Why did we have that spike in 2015?
Jared might be better suited to speak to the.
Okay, we can ask him when he gets on then.
I mean, I think emissions are volatile, but I'm not sure what drove that particular year of high emissions in 2015.
Yeah.
So efficient transit and electric vehicles, as I just mentioned, both transportation and buildings and thermal have largely seen a lack of action around creative solutions and policies to drive down emissions in recent years. Because of the nature of our emissions reductions requirement, first in 2025 and 2030, we appreciate that the solutions in front of us to drive the quickest emissions reductions will come from electrification of these 2 sectors, as well as conservation long-term, about thinking about how we invest in compact settlement and communities where we can drive less. But for now, we're largely thinking about the policies and initiatives needed to help Vermonters transition to EVs, stand up EV infrastructure, and think about the policies that would be put forward to drive that. So the only 2 rulemaking items, which you may recall the GWSA has a clear component of speaking to rulemaking for the Agency of Natural Resources, and ANR is required to move forward with advancing the rules put forward in the Climate Action Plan by July 1st of this year. The only 2 rules that were put forward in this Climate Action Plan speak to adoption of California's Advanced Clean Car 2 and Clean Truck Rule. And that is something that the Agency of Natural Resources is moving on right now and will present to the council this spring those rules before they go to LCAR on July 1st. Those will help require manufacturers to sell an increasing number of zero emission vehicles through 2035. ICAR, I should have said instead of LCAR, sorry. And I should say that at the 11th hour, as we were moving forward with signing the Climate Action Plan, you may have heard that TCIP, which was the largest policy driver within this space that was being put forward by the Climate Council to both realize emissions reductions and realize revenues that could go to further other policy initiatives. Both Massachusetts and Connecticut pulled out of TCIP, making the regional nexus not viable. And so as right now, there is a transportation task group working to figure out other policy recommendations by this spring that will plug the TCIP sized hole that's left within the Climate Action Plan. And I just do want to highlight that long-term solutions for transit solutions in Vermont really speak to creating infrastructure that supports more walking and biking, and educating drivers on the benefits of electrification and other transportation options to reduce vehicle miles traveled. This data is being updated, and I keep meaning this is sort of a shifting target right now within we are doing a Vermont Pathways report that speaks to the targets that we are needed for putting EVs on the road, homes weatherized. That report is currently being finalized and will be put out by the end of this month, early February. But the early numbers that were projected show an amazing growth in EV sales in Vermont. The numbers that were originally put forward in the report speak to going from less than 5,000 EVs on the road right now to 43,000 by 2025 and 166,000 by 2030. We understand and appreciate that these numbers are likely going to go down a bit based on the modeling that we're doing, but the message is here is that we want to see really impressive growth in EV sales in Vermont in order to support the transition for transportation emissions reductions.
Oh, Mr. Chair.
Yes.
Please.
Jane, I'm sorry, but it's not our jurisdiction, but it's such an intriguing data point that I hadn't seen before. If you just go back to your last slide, I'm curious, on a given 3-year cycle, do we even sell 43,000 new vehicles in Vermont? I'd love a sense of the scale of, it's one thing to wonder if we can encourage EV sales to that level, but just in raw vehicle numbers, can you help me understand this sense of scale there?
Yeah, I would appreciate if Jared could scale me, like phone a friend here to actually speak to the specifics as well. But I do know that our whole vehicle fleet changes over roughly every 9 years in Vermont. And therefore, we're looking at a large increase of the sales. Here it says by 2025, in order to meet these numbers, it would be 40% of share of the sales of new vehicles would be EVs. So it does go to say that it looks like we would be able to meet these numbers based on the number of vehicles being bought in the state. Whether or not these vehicles will be available is a question still, and what the drivers are in order to ensure that the market provides these vehicles to the state is really the question right now. But Jared, if I messed anything up, I really appreciate if you would state that better for me.
Thanks, Jane. Just specifically to your question, Senator Pearson, about how many vehicles are sold in Vermont each year. In terms of new vehicle registrations, it varies, but it's roughly around 40,000 usually. That's about a third of overall vehicle registrations. Usually 2/3 are used vehicles in a given year. I will say that recently we've seen a significant increase. There was a doubling within the last year of the share of electric vehicles as out of our overall vehicle registration. So in 2020, about only 2.7% of new vehicle sales were electric vehicles. Last year in 2021, it was 5.4%. So we saw a doubling, and at this early stage of market transformation, it's difficult to project, is that going to continue to be an exponential doubling each year? Is it going to be more linear growth? The one thing that we do know we can count on that either Jane or I can address in a little bit is that one of the recommendations in the Climate Action Plan is to follow with California and other states in adopting the Advanced Clean Cars 2 rule, which sets requirements for automobile manufacturers in terms of making zero emission vehicles available for sale in Vermont. And so following Advanced Clean Cars 2 would, the initial estimates for Vermont provide about 95,000 electric vehicles for sale in Vermont between model year 2026 and 2030. That would not go into effect into 2026. So there's the question of what will EV availability and sales be between now and then. But I do want to note that that 2025 number is a cumulative number of total electric vehicle registrations, not just in that 1 year.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I appreciate the indulgence. It's a little off topic, but very relevant to the mission here.
And one other short question on that. Would that represent, by going to this number that's showing by 2025, would that equate to about a third of all new vehicles sold in Vermont? So we'd have to jump to, 10, 12,000 vehicles by 2025.
I mean, Bobby, I think
Gary,
that makes
go ahead.
sense. I mean, you got like the electric F-150 coming out this year, and I know a lot of people who have signed up for that. So electric vehicles aren't anymore just the small cars that a lot of my constituents wouldn't drive, but they're starting to become the SUVs and the pickup trucks. So, I mean, I know 2025 is only a few years away, but I think once that F-150 comes out, I'm sure there's gonna be 300-400 of them sold here in St. Albans. I think they already have 200 orders in at our local Ford dealer.
Yeah. Jane, you want to continue or?
Sure. Yeah, thanks. So moving on to the buildings and thermal sector, this again is second to transportation. It produces roughly 36% of Vermont's emissions. The two largest policy areas that have been recommended by the council are first and foremost expanding weatherization, getting homes safely, more safe, more comfortable, healthier, in order to prepare them also to fuel switch, to think about opportunities to put in heat pumps and electrifying heating sources, as well as still pushing forward advanced clean wood and other renewable energy sources that are lower carbon footprint. The other policy that you're likely hearing about across the legislature right now that's getting a lot of attention is the development of an implementation of a clean heat standard. This is a performance standard driving transition to less carbon intensive heating practices. It's something that has been a high priority to move forward this legislative session in order to have folks, the PUC, think about what the design would look like for the clean heat standard in order to have it in place in time to realize the benefits of the emissions reductions that we would need by 2030. That beyond those two, and weatherization, I should say, is front and center in the governor's package for ARPA dollars. There's an $80 million recommendation to invest in weatherization with ARPA, as well as another ARPA capital project that speaks to weatherization and fuel switching for building municipal resilience centers that right now is within A&R's budget, but there's a work group thinking about where that money is best suited to build those resilience centers. So this is really something that we know weatherization is key to making all of this work, but weatherization will only get us roughly 25% of that 80% emissions reductions we need in the buildings and thermal sector by 2050. So we know that in addition to thinking about weatherization, we need to be putting in policies that help homeowners, commercial buildings and industrial buildings think about how to adopt clean and energy efficient options. Not dissimilar, the numbers for weatherization are quite steep. And obviously, for work like this, it's not only about getting homes weatherized, it's about investing in the workforce needed to realize these opportunities. Homes weatherized, it's roughly over the last decade have been roughly 15,000 homes. And we want to be thinking about how to increase and scale up. I should say it's been roughly 30,000 homes over the last decade, and we need to increase roughly 90,000 new homes between now and 2030. So we're talking about a significant scale up, and this, I'm glad I preemptively corrected myself to 30,000 before the slide came. And so it shows that this work really is going to be on an impressive trajectory, but there are significant co-benefits with weatherization, providing folks jobs, thinking about healthier, safer homes for people, and really getting those homes ready and to transition to cleaner fuel sources. Other opportunities, we've made significant progress in our electricity sector, largely because of the current renewable energy standard. But we're thinking a lot about how to build resilience into our electricity sector, as well as thinking about the ultimate demand on our electricity sector, especially beyond 2030, as we think about really a doubling of electricity needs in Vermont, really largely to fuel that transportation transition as well as our home heating transportation. So we're thinking about policies and strategies that help enable Vermonters to choose electrification, and then working with policymakers and others to think about what could be done to enhance the res beyond 2030 in order to provide clean and reliable electricity that will keep us on track to meet our 2050 emissions reduction. And this model just largely shows where that growth in the electricity sector is expected between now and 2050. And you can really see that growth in the transportation sector, also somewhat in the residential sector and commercial and industrial buildings as well. The Climate Action Plan also speaks to other greenhouse gas reduction opportunities. It speaks to opportunities in the agricultural space that this presentation doesn't cover in detail, but I know with Ryan and Abby here that you're in good hands to answer some of those detailed questions about ag and the opportunities there for mitigation. But it does speak to improving manure management and implement methane capture where appropriate on the right size farms. Thinking about emissions from refrigerants that have high global warming potential. We did a really good job of transitioning away from refrigerants that were ozone depleting, only to replace them with high global warming potential refrigerants. These are opportunities to invest in our rural communities and grocery stores to think about a transition. Thinking about how we reduce emissions of fluorinated gases from our one and only semiconductor manufacturing, and that is an opportunity with global foundries, and there's a lot of dialogue there. And then low-hanging fruit of really making sure ensuring flares are operational at all existing municipal wastewater digesters. What this graph shows is really that gray dotted bar. We would realize emissions reductions based on our current policy scenarios. And that gray bar shows the expectation of reducing emissions, but it doesn't go nearly far enough with the policies and programs and measures in place to actually realize the requirements of the GWSA. And this really is illustrative of the aggressive scale and pace needed for us to be on track to meet our 2050 requirement. It's going to take intervention, and we're hopeful that those opportunities are seen as just that, co-benefits, opportunities to realize a cleaner transition in Vermont that's beneficial for all Vermonters. I'll move through this quickly because I hope and expect others will chime in through their testimony with more details, but just to highlight some of the opportunities that I know you all as a Senate committee care about. This is largely the work of Ag and Ecosystems, and Abby did allude to some of this, but just briefly, this subcommittee really focused on how to build resilience in both our working and natural lands, understanding that I know you all do, that it's critical to ensure that these lands, first and foremost, stay on the landscape. Lands like working forest, agricultural lands are our best opportunity here in Vermont for adapting and building resilience in our community and in our communities as we face the changing climate. So we want to be thinking about investing in agriculture and working land management practice that mitigate emissions and improve resilience. These are often have co-benefits with other things the state is working on and cares about, such as clean water. And we're working closely to calculate what those benefits are in the mitigation space so that we can really invest in supporting our farmers, putting these practices on the ground. Thinking about how we expand nature-based solutions and understanding of traditional ecological knowledge, and helping that drive where we invest in strategic conservation and promoting healthy and connected river corridors, floodplains, and wetlands. And again, it's really about supporting and empowering Vermont's natural and working landowners and expanding local markets so that these lands are resilient and working functionally for the people that provide them for us and all the benefits that they comprise on the landscape. Vital communities. We're thinking about how to prioritize planning practices and investments that help Vermont communities prepare for climate impacts. Some of the imminent tools that are articulated in the GWSA are focused now for the Council and the Rural Resilience and Adaptation Subcommittee to advance in the coming year. There was a particular attention in the GWSA given to a climate toolkit. And we met just yesterday with the subcommittee to think about a group that will manage and think about how to provide technical assistance and the right tools and delivery to municipalities so that municipalities can understand and take advantage of the incentives, the planning, the programs that are already there, and think about where the gaps are and how to help support communities in standing up resilient communities. We thought about recommendations and strategies to update land use policies that could better support adaptive, resilient, compact settlement for all the benefits that it has, both in resilience and adaptation, but also for emissions reductions. We thought about resilience of key infrastructure and how to specifically tailor the strategies and recommendations that came out of the cross-sector mitigation to make them applicable to municipalities. And then, of course, throughout all of this was an underpinning that during this critical time of a housing shortage in Vermont that is only being exacerbated over the last few years, that we lift up and speak to how ensuring all access to safe, energy efficient, affordable housing is critical to building resilience in our communities. Carbon capture and storage was a focus of the Ag and Ecosystem Subcommittee. And there was a lot of discussion about programs that we currently have on the books or opportunities to expand them to think about where we can enhance practices that maintain and increase carbon storage. There were recommendations, and some of those are playing out within the legislature now around changes to use value appraisal program to foster and enhance old forest characteristics on the landscape. There was opportunities considered around where carbon markets would make sense on Vermont's landscape to enhance forest structure and again, old forest characteristics to store and sequester carbon. And there were discussions around payment for ecosystem services currently being explored, as you all know, in detail in the agricultural sector, but also thinking about how we can expand that on our working forest land. All of this is to say we want to put systems in place and programs in place that support and enhance our forest land, as well as which is currently on a decrease in Vermont. This plan and program stood up our first carbon budget for the state, and it's something that we hope to replicate, but it shows a trajectory of losing the ability to sequester carbon. We're on that downward slope, and that has a lot to do with forest loss, as illustrated on this slide, but it also has to do with the compounding impacts on our existing forests as forests get older, forests are more less resilient to climate change and drought structure, and so we're thinking about practices that can be put in place not only to conserve our remaining working forest and but also practices that can make them more resilient to carbon sequestration and storage. The loss, I don't need to tell this committee, but we're also seeing that same loss in our agricultural lands and thinking about how we put systems in place to really maintain agricultural lands on the landscape. Finally, before I wrap up, the group did its best. Some of the challenges with the short timeline meant that the subcommittees had a lack of time to really come together and foster collaborative solutions. But in the end, we were able to stand up some recommendations that were the most low-hanging fruit to help us meet all of our climate action goals. So thinking about how we support compact settlement patterns, there were recommendations around Act 250, a state land use policy and plan, thinking about an environmental justice policy and the benefit that that would provide in standing up a just transitions across all of our recommendations, how to think about workforce development and personal actions that Vermonters can take to really realize the climate benefits that Vermonters want to help participate in. So overall, within the climate action plan, you'll find the way the plan is organized is 26 pathways, which are really written very broad, high level. And then the plan dives down deeper into 64 strategies, which are really intended to be measurable activities. And then 234 specific action steps all nested between pathways, strategies, and actions. It's an impressive body of work, and really one that the council should be proud of. Work going forward doesn't stop here. As I said, we see this as an initial plan, one to build upon. The Climate Council itself, illustrated by the acronym DCC there, is working to think about strategies still for the transportation sector, appreciating that TCIP was sort of, the rug was pulled out at the 11th hour. We're working to think about actions there that continued to foster and enhance emissions reductions in that space. What's not also noted on this slide is at the end, we also pulled the recommendations on biomass, and there will be a work group working on revisiting actions related to biomass and how we speak to biomass generation within the Climate Action Plan. The Climate Council was able to advance recommendations for the utilization of ARPA, both to the legislature and the governor in December. And it's something that we'll continue to advocate for, to invest ARPA dollars in climate action to realize the success of this plan. The Climate Council will continue to meet to budget and support technical analyses needed to support this plan. There were a number of recommendations that were put forward in the CAP to further study areas such as agricultural emissions to ensure that we're doing our best to track ag emissions within the state's greenhouse gas inventory, and that we're in line with IPCC guidance, as well as thinking about how we prioritize work needed to build equity into climate action and ensure a just transition, the application of those guiding principles and scoring rubric. A&R is moving forward with completing our pathways analysis, rulemaking, and we'll be standing up public engagement over the course of the next few months in close concert with the Vermont Climate Council. In addition, we have some remaining statutory obligations. We're working with the Rural Resilience Subcommittee, as well as Science and Data and others on the council to work on the Municipal Vulnerability Index that was required by the GWSA, as well as standing up the measuring and assessing progress tool that I spoke to briefly earlier. And Joint Fiscal is putting together an economic analysis of the whole climate action plan right now, and we're working really closely to help support that with the modeling and analysis that we did for this first CAP. With the CAP adopted, it really is a handoff back to the legislature now. Almost all of the actions within the CAP, not all, I should say, but some of the highest priority, most critical to support our emissions reductions, as well as build resilience and adaptation, will need the support and work of the legislature over this session and beyond. We also hope and appreciate that the legislature will work to fully appropriate ARPA dollars for climate action and take into consideration the recommendations the council stood up and put forward. And understanding that going forward, there will need to be continual investment in technical analysis and contractor support for the GWSA and the budget to the Agency of Natural Resources to do so. And finally, I'll just say that a critique of the council from the beginning has been a lack of diversity on the council, and we'll continue to advocate and work with the legislature, who controls 15 seats on the council, that as vacancies arise, that we'll want to support diverse appointments, as well as consider how we accurately reflect compensation for council members. Last year, we worked really closely with Senator Ron Hinsdale for a budget adjustment to have councilors paid more than the $50 per diem. But that is something that we'll be reconsidering. That wasn't successful last year, I should say, but we'll be continuing to look at avenues to realize just compensation for councilors and subcommittee members who really have given above and beyond what was needed, what we needed to realize this first CAP. So with that, that's a ton of information. I will stop sharing. Happy to answer any questions, and really appreciate other counselors speaking to their expertise in this area.
Well, thank you, Jane. As we would say in the Ag Committee, I think you gave us a whole load of hay. And sometimes you only get a bale or two, but I think, it was very well done. Appreciate it. Any questions right now for Jane? If not, I think I have a couple of questions, but I think Jared's going to be maybe the one to ask the question, my questions to. Anyways, so is Jared up next?
I think Lauren and I are, if that's all okay, Chairman. And Lauren's got some of our slides to share. We've already done our introductions. I'm just going to start off. I should say, for the record, Jared Duvall, member of the Vermont Climate Council. The roles that both I and Lauren play on the council are on the screen right now. We've kind of broken our part of the presentation into some emphasis on, I'll focus on some of the climate pollution reduction measures that are in the Climate Action Plan, and Lauren's going to speak more to some of the resilience and adaptation and kind of agriculture and ecosystems related aspects. So next slide, please. So, this context is, I think folks are familiar with, but I think it's also really important that we pause on it. The IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, has clearly said that we have less than a decade to cut our greenhouse gas pollution in half to avoid the worst impacts of a destabilized climate. We know that Vermont has had goals in this area for over a decade, but has been missed almost every year until there was the Global Warming Solutions Act that turned those goals into requirements. And I think one of the biggest reasons for continually missing our goals in terms of climate pollution reduction was because our state energy and climate policy has primarily focused on energy efficiency and the electricity sector, which are both very important, but has largely ignored establishing policy and regulatory frameworks around our two highest polluting and highest cost energy sectors, which are transportation and thermal or building heating. Of course, Vermont cannot solve this global crisis alone. No state, no country can, but we all do have a responsibility to do our part, both in terms of the math of collective action and also, I would argue, from a moral perspective. Of course, the CAP is designed to focus on reducing climate pollution and meeting that legal requirement in the GWSA, but that is just a part of an overall strategy that is really aimed at an equitable transition and saving Vermonters money, strengthening our local economy, and preparing our communities to weather really increasing extremes and climate impacts. So next slide, please. So this is the slide that you asked a question about, Chairman Starr, and actually, if it's okay to answer it, I'm gonna, if I can take the share screen to share a couple of things that I pulled up. It is difficult to say with 100% certainty what led to the spike in emissions in 2015, but the three main things that I would point to, it says host disabled participant screen sharing, are three. One, fossil fuel prices, they are over time very price volatile, but there was a significant decline in gasoline, diesel, fuel oil, propane prices between 2014 and 2015, which led to an increase in fossil fuel purchases in 2015. The winter of 2015 was also very cold as measured by the number of heating degree days. And when we have colder winters, we see increases in fuel oil and propane and natural gas use, especially when we're coming off of a previous winter when those fossil fuels were more expensive. Oftentimes we do see some Vermonters, if they have multiple heating systems, when fossil fuel prices are high, they'll heat more with a wood stove and less with fossil. But when those fossil prices go down, they'll shift the kind of balance of their heating in that direction. And then the last thing I would say, or the two other things, are when gas prices are low, as they were in 2015, after being higher in the period previous, we see an increase in vehicle miles traveled. And then the last thing on the electricity sector, why we saw an increase in 2015, is because that was around the timing of the closure of Vermont Yankee. And when we had nuclear power leaving our electricity portfolio, which is relatively low carbon, in the very short term, it was replaced by ISO New England grid mix, which is very largely natural gas. That has since gone way down because of the renewable energy standard requiring Vermont's portfolio to become much more lower emitting. So let me see if I can share screen now. I can. So this just shows that significant, both the volatility in gasoline and diesel prices, but also that decline we saw in prices over that period. And then here we see it on the heating side, which again, that lots of volatility, but the prices were going down in that period when we saw the emissions spike.
That tracks pretty well.
So Lauren, if it's all right to go back to the.
Jared's really testing my flexibility and quickness on Zoom here.
Sorry. So I think we can go past that slide now. And this is just another way of looking at it that shows the emissions by sector. You know, you see agriculture there, the third highest bar at 16% of emissions, but about 3/4 of our climate pollution is coming from how we get around and our current dependence on fossil fueled vehicles and fossil fueled heating systems. Next slide, please.
Jared, could I ask you a question on fossil fuels and some of the work you're doing? I haven't heard anyone mention anything about aviation fuel. Is there a difference between aviation fuel and emissions compared to autos and trucks and all the other vehicles?
Yeah, the vast majority of our transportation emissions come from our light duty fleet. I don't have it right in front of me, but I think it's over 70%. Most of the remainder is from the heavy duty fleet. The emissions from aviation fuel are tracked in Vermont, but it is, it is in the low single digits in terms of a contribution. There is a lot of research happening into biofuels that can be used as a kind of blend or replacement in aviation fuels, but in terms of the overall scale of the problem, both in Vermont and globally, it's relatively small compared to all the gasoline and diesel used for our on-road vehicles.
Yeah, I don't know why, but I was fooling around with the iPad and it showed and asked about air flights and patterns where they flew. And if you put Vermont up over Vermont, up in the sky here, it looks like the whole place is all full of air traffic up there. And so I was just asking, knowing that we don't use it a lot, but there's a lot up above us that could be using fuel.
That's a great point, and it speaks to the way that our emissions inventory and the emissions inventory of other states and countries are done, which is it's looking at the fuel consumption within our borders. So if there are airplanes going over Vermont, those emissions, while they're kind of above us, they're not captured in our inventory if that fuel is bought and consumed in another place where those flights are originating.
Yeah, thanks.
Mr. Chair, it's just worth noting too, as we've looked at gas prices and issues related over the years, I believe the feds pretty well preempt a lot of state interaction on airplane fuels and some of those issues. So in terms of our impact or ability to have any influence, it's pretty negligible. Although I can't help but point out that here at the Burlington Airport, they are trying, and a lot of money and energy going into sort of electrification of air travel, which certainly in the shipping world would be a huge, have a decent impact.
So,
go ahead, Jared.
Okay. So as Jane mentioned, over 230 recommended actions in the climate action plan. that's a lot to sort through and focus on. So we wanted to lift up, at least in terms of the meeting the emissions reduction requirements, two of the two highest impact policy recommendations in the climate action plan. Number one is the clean heat standard, which as proposed would accomplish about a third of our needed emissions reduction by 2030. That is currently before the House Energy and Technology Committee. They're taking testimony on it all this week and I believe next week. But from an emissions reduction perspective, that is the highest impact recommendation in the climate action plan. The second behind it was the Transportation and Climate Initiative before that fell apart 2 weeks before the climate action plan was due. And as Jane said, that is now leading us to deliberate about what are the policy options we are going to recommend in a revision to the climate action plan to give us some confidence and certainty that we can have a policy framework that ensures we're reducing that climate pollution. We have that already in the electricity sector with the renewable energy standard. It's a performance standard that ensures our electricity sector is getting cleaner year after year. That has been proposed in the heating sector with the clean heat standard, which is a similar performance standard approach. That one of the biggest challenges we face now is that our highest polluting sector does not have a policy or regulatory framework around it that ensures we'll reduce pollution from there. So it is too early to say what that recommendation will be. Two of the leading options that are under consideration by the cross-sector mitigation subcommittee, there may be others that emerge, but the two that we know we want to explore further are the possibilities of a clean transportation standard and also the possibility and/or, these are not mutually exclusive, and/or joining with our neighbors to the north in Quebec, also California, in what is known as the Western Climate Initiative. But that conversation will develop over the next few months. Hopefully we'll be able to do significant more study and analysis and deliberation and public engagement on those options. And we will work to get back to you with some proposed recommendations and revisions to the climate action plan in the first half of this year after we've done that work. Next slide. And then lastly, I would say, a number of these things are interrelated. Investing in weatherizing 90,000 low and moderate income homes for Vermonters, that is really important, not just for emissions reduction, but also for improving health and comfort and providing energy savings. It is very complementary to the clean heat standard. And then I would note that the other kind of next highest, that is about in the range, if we do that, of achieving about 10% of the needed emissions reduction. And then advanced clean cars, too, the rule that ANR, Agency of Natural Resources, will be going through rulemaking to implement is about a similar scale of about 10% of the needed emissions reduction by providing that many electric vehicles for sale. I will say that some of these things, you can't count on them just on their own. They require supporting or other policies. So for instance, just because 95,000 electric vehicles will be made available for sale in Vermont does not mean, in order to get them on the road replacing fossil vehicles, there also have to be incentives for people to purchase them. There also has to be the charging infrastructure to support them. So it is difficult to look at these in isolation because they're all interconnected. But I think that's it from me, and pass the baton to Lauren.
Yeah, thank you, Jared. Any questions for Jared and any his presentations? I have just one, and you probably have the answer. When you talk about emissions and how electric vehicles, are going to reduce that, what about the building of the batteries for those vehicles and the disposal of those batteries? And the other issue, I'm wondering, have you folks taken into account our climate and what happens to batteries in colder climates?
Yeah, those are great questions. I will send you, Chairman Starr, to share with the full committee. There are a number of studies that have come out over the last few years, including one from the Union of Concerned Scientists, that look at the life cycle emissions from not just the tailpipe, but also all of the production of vehicles. And they find that when you look at that life cycle, including the battery production, electric vehicles are still far superior to fossil fuel vehicles in terms of a life cycle emissions reduction. So I will share that. And yes, I mean, it's definitely a challenge that in colder temperatures, the range of an electric vehicle decreases. As an EV driver, somebody who does not use fossil fuels at all anymore, I experienced that. But I think that the two main ways that will be addressed are most of the models coming out. We have over 40 electric vehicle models in Vermont now. I think over 24 of them have all-wheel drive, either standard or optional. We're seeing an increasing range of them. And so, when an EV has a range of 250 or 300 miles, having a reduction in range of 25% isn't as big of an issue. And as we have more charging stations available, it's easier to recharge. So, for instance, I often, I grew up in the Upper Valley in Fairleigh. I live in Montpelier now. If I do that trip, really there are no level 3 chargers between those spots now. But say I went to White River Junction from Montpelier, later this year there will be a level 3 charger, thanks to the investments that the legislature and the administration are making. I think there's going to be one in Randolph. So the more that we can build out the charging infrastructure across all of Vermont, I think it will also help address that issue.
Yeah, thank you, Jared.
Bobby?
Yes, yeah, Anthony.
Yeah, I have a question. In terms of looking at electric vehicles, which is obviously very important, I'm wondering what role or how you looked at public transportation to fit into these strategies.
Yes, and I would welcome Jane to add in here as well, but that was certainly in the list of actions. I can't remember exactly where it was. I believe there's a recommendation, correct me if I'm wrong, I believe there's a recommendation around extending fare-free transit, both in terms of the emissions reduction benefits of that, and that from an equity perspective, and looking more at on-demand microtransit, as is happening, as you know, Senator, with some successful pilots in Montpelier and beyond.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah. Any other questions from committee members?
Bobby, I got one.
Yeah. Sorry?
So we saw on the slides about, especially because we're the agriculture committee and that's where our lane is, you show the emissions, but are we giving agriculture the credit of the carbon storage and the offsets that they're doing in that number? Or, how are we looking at that right now?
So the way that the greenhouse gas emissions inventory is done for Vermont, and has always been done, is looking at the gross emissions or the sources of emissions. The carbon budget project, which Ryan and Abby can speak to, is aiming towards being able to look at those net emissions after accounting for sequestration and ag forestry and other land use. In the Global Warming Solutions Act, the kind of net targets are not spoken to until 2050. The 2025 and 2030 emissions reduction requirements are from our sources of emissions, of gross emissions. There are a lot of challenges around historical data and being able to accurately track going forward what is actually achieved from sequestration, and making sure that they are real, verifiable, and durable. And a lot more work has to happen in that area.
So, but theoretically, ag's actual net impact could be a lot less, if not, I don't know where it is. So
there's a great carbon budget report that has some initial estimates around ag and forestry that we can share, and that looks at that. But there are still significant net emissions even after accounting for sequestration from land use.
my point is just we beat up on the farmer with what they do for water quality. We beat up on them for this, and they do a lot of work for, they're the ones keeping our landscapes open. I mean, I live in one of the fastest growing corners of the state, and if it weren't for the farms up here, you'd have a lot more houses. So, I think they deserve the credit that they're due, what they are doing.
Corey, the most important thing they do is feed us.
That too.
Jared, anything else or any other questions from the committee? If not, would you like to move on to, Brian, Senator Collmore?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I just copied down clean heat standard and 34% reduction. Can you talk a little bit about what are the elements that are going to go into a clean heat standard? What are we going to change to get to that 34% reduction?
I would be happy to, but I think that that's a much longer conversation, and I don't want to eat in more to. I mean, I will defer to the committee's wishes, but I feel like that is a longer conversation. I'm also happy to send some resources in the meantime that might be helpful.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, that would be good, Jared. I don't want to take up any more time, but when I built my house 40 years ago, I put electric heat through the whole place. It was only a few years, the policies in Montpelier changed, and they had winter rates mandatory and put in to cut down on the use. And so I had to change over my whole house because I couldn't afford electric heat anymore. So, policies sometimes drive us to do things differently. And as long as we're all headed in the right direction, this may be good. But I hope once we get there, then we don't change everything around and make it worse. But anyways, let's move on to Jane.
I think I'm going to jump in, if that's okay, Jane, unless you had more to say.
Lauren, yes, go ahead.
I was going to punt to you, please.
Thank you, Chair Starr. Before I jump in, actually, just recognizing that there's a little time, I wonder if Ryan especially wants to jump in to answer Senator Parent's question about the net versus gross emissions from the ag sector, since he was kind of our expert in the subcommittee, and I want to make sure that if Senator Parent still has questions about that Ryan can really speak to it, since he's so fluent in that realm.
Yeah, if you just wait a minute, we could switch to Ryan for an answer to that question. Ryan, are you there?
I am, Senator.
Well, welcome.
Thank you. Ryan Pat, Vermont Agency of Agriculture, Food and Markets. Glad to be here. Should we stop? I guess we'll just answer this question before moving on, but we have about 10 minutes left in our time today. And so I would request the opportunity to come back and dig into that question more deeply, Senator Parent, that you raised. I disagree with Mr. Duvall with his characterization that soil carbon sequestration, ag soils, isn't ready for prime time. California, as an example, has a healthy soils program, which utilizes, a modeling tool to calculate the rate of carbon sequestration and sends those credits to the Air Resources Board. So other states are certainly leveraging the opportunities that the natural and working lands have in Vermont. And your point is well taken that 60% emissions is a growth calculation, and a large part of the work of the Ag and Ecosystem Subcommittee, as well as a request that was put into the Climate Council that was approved, and it's also part of the initial climate action plan, is further research into this space to attempt to reconcile really what the IPCC says is a unique land use sector. And that would be a lot of what I would seek to share with this committee in how, for example, the Global Warming Solutions Act didn't come to the committee's jurisdiction for agriculture on both the House and Senate side. And there are some specific questions that are unique to agriculture that don't impact, well, when I say agriculture, I mean the natural and working lands, agriculture, forestry, and other land uses, how it's defined by the IPCC, and really digging into how this sector is currently contributing significant climate benefit through the water quality programming that has delivering such successful phosphorus reductions for the state. Many of those same practices have the ability to both reduce emissions from the soil surface as well as increase sequestration in agricultural soil. And that is a really important conversation, and ensuring that a method for tracking and crediting the work that farmers are doing in this space, and certainly relative to either the 1990 or 2005 baseline. For recent years, since 2016, we have exceptional tracking on an acre by acre basis, which tracks farmer individual implementation of conservation plans for which there are accepted emission reduction coefficients when those practices are applied on a field by field basis. And so there's a lot to get into, and there's a lot of opportunity here. And the agricultural mitigation work is certainly one piece of the broader services that agriculture can play in helping the state meet its climate goals, including adapting and building resilience on farms and within the watershed, as well as Senator Starr, as you pointed out, providing food in what is certainly becoming potentially a more challenging supply chain situation, whether that's COVID related or climate related. So I appreciate the opportunity, Lauren. Thank you for being able to jump in and add to Senator Parent's question, and would really like the opportunity to dig into greater detail on that point. Thank you.
Yeah, Brian, we've got a little time tomorrow, but we have Friday morning. We have another hour and a half that we might be able to spend on this. So we'll be in touch. Linda will be in touch with you.
Bobby,
Lauren,
before we move on, another piece of this is what agriculture is doing. If we have time to take more issues up, I'd like to hear from Vermont Gas about that digester project they're doing with renewable natural gas and what their vision is for that. Because I think maybe not the forever solution, but it could be a good bridge solution that works through things. So while we're looking at that, I just want to put a plug in to learn more about what they're doing.
Yeah, well, we can have the digester folks in too, Corey. And we've been stealing time from Lauren here for the last hour, so welcome back, and we'll open up to you, Lauren.
Thank you, Chair Starr. Join Ryan and urging the committee to bring back members of the Ag and Ecosystem Subcommittee. There's just so much work, as Jared and Jane said, 230 plus actions, a lot of which came out of our subcommittee and which are really germane for this committee's consideration and attention. Not to keep ceding my time, but I don't know how much more overview is helpful necessarily. And I just want to acknowledge that Abby is a working farmer and should probably be outside right now. So I'm going to ask that we are invited back if possible, but give the rest of these 6 minutes over to Abby. Thank you so much for your time today.
Yeah, thank you. And we'll, any of you that would like to come back, once we get the time figured out, Linda can get back hold of you and we'll give this another run.
That'd be great.
Abby, welcome back.
Hi, I think since we did touch on the agricultural emissions piece, I think in conclusion, the thing that I would just add for context is, so my family and I, we're about to go on to, we hope, sign the papers for our second conservation easement, which will shore up about, in total, I believe it'll be 550 acres that our easement will contain of farm, forest, wetland, wildland, grasslands, the entire ecosystem. And so in conclusion, I think, to the emissions inventory point, none of the work that I do here on a daily basis is represented in that emissions inventory. It is calculated on a per cow per acre basis. So the fact that our entire farm is in primarily forest, and also we don't plow. So our entire farm is permanent sod. We raise native perennial grasses and feed our cattle from that. So in terms of a climate resilience standpoint, our farm is highly resilient. We're at 2,000 feet, so we're in headwaters. So it's really important that we employ those methods. And it seems to me that, to Senator Parent's point, I need to really drive home to you that your farmers are stuck in an impossible nexus at this moment between the macroeconomic forces in which they don't have any control over, the fact that between the environmental regulations, the animal care regulations, and then the food safety regulations, none of which ever talk to one another. What your farmers are facing on an everyday basis is the constant need to be, I mean, it's funny, for such a stubborn, independent, kind of impossible group of people, we are highly adaptive. We have to be. We don't have the luxury of not compromising. We compromise on an everyday basis. This is and so the thing that I really need folks to take away is that none of those things are talking to one another, and often they cut each other off, or doing one thing in one way kneecaps your ability to do something in another. And we're all operating, even your organic producers are all operating on such a tight margin that to be able to innovate and respond in the moment to all of those different regulatory factors coming from so many different places is literally putting us in a place where, as I alluded to earlier, for the next generation, particularly for beginning farmers who tend to have student debt, this is not a viable career path. And we desperately need these people for so many reasons, right? Not just food production, but also for climate and environmental resilience and adaptation. And so I think at the very least, it would mean a lot to me if we could have some really concrete funding and research to go forward so that the work that the farmers are doing is accurately represented in how we're measuring our contributions. Because I had somebody play the devil's advocate with me the other day and ask, there are some proposals on the table in PES that are considered a bit radical, talking about paying for soil building and essentially what would be a small farm base payment of $10,000 if you met certain environmental regulations. And somebody asked me, well, playing devil's advocate, we don't pay the hardware store owner to get up out of bed every day. Why should we pay the farmer? And very good point, and totally true, to which I said, well, I don't think the hardware store owner is going to get out of bed for very long if they don't have food. We don't think about agriculture as food. But agriculture is food. And I think we're really facing an issue right now in that when we talk about agriculture, we get a certain image in our head of certain problems that we're facing and trying to navigate. And we don't think about the repercussions that those issues and those narratives have on the people who are creating food. And food security is going to be critical moving forward. And in this moment post-COVID, where 1 in 3 Vermonters are food insecure. So if I can leave you with anything, that's where I guess I'll close this up today, 1 minute ahead of 10:30. Thank you so much for your time.
Yes, and if you want to come back another day, any of you are always welcome. And we try in our committee to work all the different opinions and ideas, and then we try to sometimes get those passed in other committees, but we do our best to listen and respond, and so any of you are welcome back. We'll probably shoot for Friday morning. So Linda will be in touch. Any questions or issues that the committee members have that our guests could look at in between now and Friday and report back on if they haven't got the answer? Chris?
What would help me is the recommendations I'm hearing in terms of concrete steps are largely out of the budget, and I think not going to be hard to get support for more conservation dollars, VHCB, strong support out of this committee historically. So just helping us understand policy changes or specifics of dollar asks. Ryan, as we know, has been in part of the payment for ecosystem services, which this committee has made a priority to make sure keeps getting funded. I'll speak for myself and say I'm ready for us to move beyond discussion and research if we can. So anyway, I think there's a lot
You and
of
I both, Senator.
so maybe just help us understand concrete steps. We're a committee of legislators, so we change policy or we advocate for budgets. And what do you need? What are we not seeing in the big budget, in the governor's recommendation that we need, and any policy changes, just real concrete for us would be helpful.
Yeah. Any committee members, anything else? If not, I want to thank each and every one of you folks for your time this morning. I know at business, I always had on my computer screens, time is money. And so I know your time is expensive and valuable to you, and we certainly appreciate that. So thank you. And committee, we'll take a short break, and at 10:45 we have food people coming in. So